Good morning. Good morning, everybody. And as you probably saw on the note, this is the IEDP Speaker Series. We are very fortunate to have Professor Kwame Akyeampong with us today. Thank you very much for joining us. This is early morning in the United States, so we know you better have a cup of coffee if you're on the US side, but maybe a cup of tea if you're over in India or Singapore or somewhere. Delighted to have you. This is organized so that it would not compete with other courses that are being taught in the mornings here in the United States. Professor Akyeampong, as you read on the invitation material, is a professor at the Open University in London, or in the London region. He taught and researched for many years at also the University of Sussex. I first met Kwame, I think, at UNESCO headquarters when you were working on the Global Monitoring Report.
That's right.
Back years ago, and we've since seen each other on many occasions at conferences and so on, and have invited him at least a half a dozen times to come to Penn, and we only got him due to, he is so busy, it took COVID to force him and us to invite him through this video link through Zoom. But delighted to have you here, and we will try to get you in person once we figure out how to fly again. I want to say just a couple of words about your own background for the students. You are originally from Ghana, and I believe you did your degree, PhD, where?
In the University of Nottingham in England.
Very good. And then you went back to University of Cape Coast to head up an Institute on Education, I believe, right?
That's right, yes.
And since that time, you've been you've really been in international education, research, development, policy.
Yes.
We used to call them a wonk, W-O-N-K, that's the positive sense. But Dr. Akyeampong's work is widely cited in the international development and education field. He is a prominent member of the CIES, which many people on this call will know very well and have attended in the past. He's worked with major international organizations like UNESCO, World Bank, the British government, et cetera, et cetera. This introduction, as I mentioned, is very abbreviated. I could say a lot more about the work that he's done. We're very fortunate today to have him come and talk about his latest work, Reconceptualizing Teacher Education for Inclusive Learning in African Classrooms. He is probably the most well-known researcher who's doing work in this area in the African region. We are so glad to have you with us. The organization of today, since we're planning to stop at about 9:05 US time, Dr. Akyeampong has agreed to give us a mini talk. I've heard him give more maxi talks at different moments, but he's going to try to limit himself to 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. There will be a live chat room. Let me say again, this is being recorded. There'll be because it's part of our series, we will release for people later on who could not come to this talk. So we'll have an active chat room. Anayata, who's the TA for this event, will hopefully keep track of some of the chats and try to bring them back into the Q&A later on. So do put your questions into the chat box. And Anayata, if you would kindly keep track of that as best you can. Very pleased. We'll give you a virtual clap as you begin, Kwame. Thank you so much for joining us. And the floor is yours, so to speak, the virtual floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dan. It's really a pleasure to be able to do this seminar. Like you know, and you said I had always wanted to come to Penn State and really meet with your students and meet your colleagues. And this year was the year I thought I could do it. And unfortunately, we know what has happened. And so when you said, look, we could do it this way, I thought, why not? This would be a great opportunity to meet with your students, but also to share some of the work that I'm doing. So it's a real pleasure to be on this, to be here for this event. And I look forward to the interaction and the feedback after my presentation. Let me start by saying that when I was thinking of preparing this, I thought that perhaps the best way to look at this issue about inclusive learning in African classrooms is to draw on some of the research that I've been doing in Sussex in the past 10 to 15 years. Because I think what has happened over the years, as I reflect on my research, is how my understanding of teacher education has changed. Teacher education for the African context has changed, and how it has made me, re-examine some of the approaches that are used, but also some of the recommendations that are made at the global level. So the approach I'm going to use is a little bit unusual in the sense that I'll say a lot about the context, and I'm trying to relate it to what I mean by the need for us to reconceptualize teacher education for inclusive learning, because I think we need to understand that. Very often, if you look at the global effort to improve learning outcomes, the emphasis is on trying to get children to improve their basic literacy and numeracy skills, which I think is very important. But I think where we are not focusing on is understanding what this environment is like and what would work in that environment. So that's how I want to start. Let me first of all then go to an assumption that we often make about inclusive learning. And I think this is the starting point I have, that there's this assumption that the general classroom teacher has the knowledge, understandings about the needs of different learners, and can utilize this inclusive teaching techniques and curriculum strategies to meet diversified learning needs. Now, if we can get the teacher to do this, then we are doing inclusive learning. And often the recommendation is, how can we do teacher education or prepare teachers to teach to be able to deliver this outcome here. But I want us to step back and look at the big question for teacher education in Africa. I think that my experience, I see there's a lot that we try to do at the international level to improve the quality of teachers for classrooms in Africa. And a lot of that emphasis is on how we can train these teachers using some of the models that we've used in the past. And I'll say something a little bit about how the emphasis on learner-centered pedagogy has been the main driver of these reforms. But I think we need to ask, how should we train teachers in Africa to maximize the learning potential of every child? Now, I've emphasized every child because we have to understand who is every child in the African classroom environment. Because I think this is where the challenge is, the problem is. And some of the research that we've done, I think has helped us to see this quite differently from the perspective of the approaches that can be used to improve learning for every child. So let me go back to ask this question. Let's start with the environment in which teachers are to teach, and ask the question, how do we characterize these environments? Okay, and what I'm going to submit in this presentation is that when you look at many typical African classrooms, what you have is classroom environments where there's insecure enrollment. I'll explain that. There's silent exclusion. The children are in classroom, but they are not learning. I'll explain why that happens. But there's also high dropout. Many of the children who are out of school have actually ever attended school in Africa. If you see the out of school population, sometimes roughly between 80 to 90% have actually been to school. And the early dropout is in the first 3 years of schooling. So there's high dropout. And then you have a challenge of some of these children coming back into school. And then you have the situation where you have a lot of overage attendance. So a lot of in the classrooms in which these teachers are going to teach, you have a lot of the children who are not at the age that is appropriate for the grade, okay? And linked to that, you also have a curriculum, a monograde curriculum, a curriculum that has been designed for the grade level. And then the teacher's assumption is that I'm going to teach children using this curriculum who are this level. But in actual fact, what you have in many of the classrooms is a multi-grade learning environment, okay? And then finally, there is also the issue of linguistic diversity and language competence. African schools and African societies, there's several languages. There's always the debate about which language should be used to maximize learning. But in many cases, the official languages are not the mother tongue languages of the children. So this is the kind of environment that we are preparing teachers to teach. What I want to suggest is that we haven't taken into account this environment in thinking about the teachers that need to be prepared, okay? And I think if we do, the way we look at teacher preparation in Africa will look very different. Let me go to the next chart. When 10 years ago, we did this study and we're looking at zones of exclusion. We mapped out the participation, attendance, learning across many countries, and we came out with this model we call the zones of exclusion. And I explained that a little bit because it's very helpful. If you think that, look here, you have 100%. If every child enters grade 1 at the age they are expected to be, that will be 100%. But you have zone 1, they are children who never enroll. They are unlikely to enroll and they should enroll. So they do not have access. Many of the children who enroll start at around 80%. Okay, so we are missing about 20% of that, about 80%. Now, if you look at 80%, as you move through the grades from primary grade 1 at the bottom here to primary grade 6, you see patterns, we see patterns evolving. First of all, you can see that in zone 2, we have primary dropouts. Between grade 1 and grade 6, there are a lot of children who are going to drop out. And part of the reason is that these children, either through poverty, through other circumstances, are not attending regularly. So they are at risk of dropping out. Then you have zone 3. Now, the zone 3 are children who are in school. You can see that's the orange bit here. They are at risk. They tend to be overage. They have low attendance. They are low attenders and achievers. So they are in the classroom, and they are roughly, you can see that as you progress, their number reduces. Then the children who actually have secure enrollment, attendance, and achievement, they fall in the green belt here. So in any classroom, this is if you take the first 6 years, in any classroom, you have this mixture, or you have this this group. And it's important that the teachers realize where these children who fit into these categories come from. So we were able to map out these zones of exclusion and look at it in terms of those who never attend, those who are in the classroom, but those who drop out as you move out to grade 6, and those who are at risk of dropping out. And you can see that by the time they get to grade 10, many of them have dropped out. When you get to here, you see that a lot of them are dropped out. So actually, in any situation, you have about 35% of the children in the classroom who are ready to learn. They attend regularly. They have come from socioeconomic backgrounds that makes them prepared and ready to learn. The curriculum actually is designed for them. So they maximize their learning, and then they are those who complete. So it's important to understand that in that classroom, when we talk about the child, this is the kind of environment we are talking about. And I'll show this next graph because it helps you to see what it looks like in different countries. If you take the first chart, which is Ghana, you would see that the green line is the age grade population. You would expect children to be in school. Now, then you have your zone 3, and then you have the secure enrollment. You see, as you move down the grades, if you take by gender, you can see how participation learning reduces as you move down the grades. This is the picture for Ghana. The next one is South Africa, which is different. In South Africa, they are very good at getting a lot more children in school and staying in school. Okay, but the picture as far as secure enrollment and meaningful learning is not too different, although it's slightly better if you look at the blue. So even in systems that are getting a lot of children in school, like South Africa, actually, a lot of them still are not learning as you would expect. So the patterns of exclusion are maybe different, but the learning problem or the learning challenge is similar. And we find that in many other African countries that we've mapped this. It's also helpful to understand where the children are coming from. And this chart is just to give you, it's an attempt from the studies we did to understand that we have an issue of household poverty, which can contribute to poor health, child health and nutrition, which has an impact on delayed progression through the grades, which had impact on late enrollment. And as the lines of influence suggest, you can see all of that has an impact on poor attendance and then poor achievement. So the child who is in the classroom has this background, has this history. Okay, so whatever you're doing in terms of your strategies, your training teachers to teach, if teachers are not aware of this, if this is not factored into the way in which they are socializing to teaching and trained to teach, a lot of the effort that still goes in improving their methods would not tackle some of the challenges that these children bring into the classroom. So that's why I think it's very important to highlight this, to understand that this really matters. The next thing to point out is it follows on what I've just said, that you know, the situation is that many children are at school and do not start school at the appropriate age. And this has consequences on who progresses in learning. The access to quality instruction really varies. So some teachers are better prepared than others, and which means that the risk of dropping out also increases depending on the teachers they have. The teaching also often targets those who are ready to learn, have strong social and economic backgrounds, and have a curriculum more suited to their learning needs. And if you look at teacher education in Africa, often it assumes that children are coming from a similar background. It presents a curriculum that completely ignores the kind of demographic characteristics within the classroom. And therefore, the teachers, even if they have inclusive strategies, are still not going to be able to ensure that the needs of some of these children are met. This is an interesting picture because what we, in some of the research we did, it's one of the things that we kept observing was that the issue of overage attendance. Now, these children are between the ages of 6 to 11. But they look, if you line them up, they all look the same height. And many of them are, in this particular case, I think they range from between 6 to 11, and sometimes you can get some of the children much older. A lot of them don't start school early because their parents feel that they are not ready because of their height, and most of that has to do with nutrition. So there's a way in which many of these rural parents determine whether the child is ready to learn. And I don't know whether, Dan, you're familiar with this, that the parents will ask the child to put their hands around, if they can touch their ear, then they're ready. But of course, many of these children are stunted. So when they try to do that, they are not able to. So they say, well, they're not ready to start school. So when we ask teachers, they assume that these children are 6 years or 7 years, but some of them are much more mature than others. Their learning needs are different. Some of them do a lot more work at home, have the whole background of these students very, very varied. And yet when we talk to teachers, they do not think this is significant in terms of what they do and how they improve learning. And I think this is important that this is highlighted in a reconceptualized teacher education program in Africa. This is the point I've made about monograde curriculum for multi-grade classrooms. The point again is that the children are often not in the grades that are appropriate for their age, which makes instruction based on grade-based curriculum inappropriate for many. So if you're going to have inclusive learning, you have to recognize that often the curriculum is not designed to be inclusive. The curriculum that the teachers have is designed in a way which really assumes children at a certain level, which for many aren't. And like I said, many of the children have a wide age range, and some of our work, we have made mention of that. This is another graph which tells you just how problematic this is. This is from a large living standard survey in Ghana, which shows in the ages in grade 1. You even have some who are 15 years, so we have between 3 to 15 years. And some of them may not look very different like the picture I showed you. So these are classrooms that typically teachers are going into. Now the question we ask ourselves is how have teachers been prepared to address the learning needs across this wide diversity of learners and backgrounds? And often this has not been adequately addressed. I think the challenge for me is that we often assume that the learning challenge is homogeneous. When you look at international literature, when we talk about the learning challenge, often it's about the learning gap. And that if we did the right things, we would help to close this learning gap. And we did the right thing means that we introduce more inclusive strategies to teaching, we would close that gap. I think that's an illusion. I think that still that would be difficult to help those who are coming from very disadvantaged backgrounds with a kind of background to actually catch up. We need to reflect that in the way in which we look at what would work. And the response has always been to introduce learner-centered pedagogy in classroom environments and also into teacher education. And if you read the literature on teacher education or schools in Africa, you would constantly find learner-centered pedagogy. It keeps failing, but it keeps being recommended. It doesn't seem like we don't seem to have any other way of solving this problem. Maybe we need to do it better. We need to improve the implementation. But a lot of some of the work we've been doing recently suggests that actually we need to really reconceptualize learner-centered pedagogy. And that's something that I can speak about another time when I have the opportunity. The third point is that there is insufficient recognition of the challenges posed by the different identities, socioeconomic histories, and backgrounds of children in classrooms. That's central to developing inclusive learning. And we need that to be recognized in terms of how we address those learning gaps. We've been working on the Global Education Advisory Panel. We looked at a lot of the evidence that is out there. And I thought I should share this one because there is the general feeling or the general evidence suggests that a lot of what we do in teacher education, initial teacher education or in-service professional development is ineffective. And yet governments spend a lot of money into teacher education. But we do know that often that investment is not yielding the kind of outputs that we are expecting. And the point that we make here in this submission is that it excludes practical training, classroom practice, which is reinforced over time. The teachers don't blame themselves or don't think, well, what do I need to do differently? They often think, what is it that needs to be? They shift the responsibility to the children. Now, this is quite typical. You know, in many of the teacher education colleges we've looked at, this is how teachers spend most of their time learning to teach. This has not changed significantly. Yes, they will have 2-3 weeks doing some training in the classroom, but the bulk of what they do is like this. And we have several images like that of teachers being trained to teach like this. Now, no matter what inclusive practices you introduce, it's going to be very difficult to get these teachers to do any form of inclusive teaching in their classes because the form in which they learn to teach is also problematic. The next slide shows just the environments. There's so many different environments, how do you prepare teachers to teach in diverse learning environments for more inclusive learning to take place in these different types of environments? And these are types of classrooms that we visited, which are across many countries. And teachers often get into these environments and they find that they are not actually, they don't know how to do that. In a classroom where you have walls, you could do, certain thing. In a classroom where you don't have, where you're sitting outside, what do you do? How do you promote inclusive learning? In a classroom where you can say it's quite a dangerous environment in which to learn, what do you do? So these are very important questions to address in the teacher education curriculum, I think. So what is this telling us about inclusive teacher education for inclusive learning in African context. And I would like to put forward, just before I end, four main points. And I think when you look at the literature on teacher education in Africa, it'd be helpful to look at it through this lens and use this to question what you see. The first is the knowledge of practice in different contexts with different learning needs. How much of that is factored into the curriculum of teacher education? And I think there's very, very little. The evidence from our research suggests that there's very little of that. And so there is a shock. Many teachers find it really very difficult to teach, and there's a high dropout rate for teachers in the early years because they just thought, this is so difficult. This is not an environment in which I was prepared to teach. The second is that I think we need to make learning to teach about learning to teach at the right level. Because of the multi-grade environment in which children come into, and that's typical, the curriculum has to be readjusted, and teachers have to look at learning through the lens of the level of the child and how you actually help children at different levels to learn. And that's the reality. And I think that needs to factor into the curriculum, the pedagogy of teacher education. The third point is a point that I've emphasized in many of my work, and it's still quite, I think we are in the early stages of understanding what it is like. I think in the global north, in the Western country, this is quite familiar. But in African context, often development agencies and groups have said, look, let's prescribe something for the teachers, to deliver, because the teachers have a weak background, and just give them a script. I think that's a mistake. That's doing a disservice to the learner. I think if we make learning to teach about problem solving, then teachers go into the classroom with a mindset that they need to pay attention to the different needs, because it's not simply about delivering a method, it's about actually solving the problem. That is helping children with different learning backgrounds and abilities to learn, and not simply a generalized method of implementation. And I think also to provide opportunity for all teachers to learn to teach in disadvantaged schools, to improve their understanding of disadvantaged schools and their students. That is very important, because then you begin to understand, okay, what works in this context? What is an inclusive practice? It is not a prescription of a set of things you do. It's a way in which you engage with the problem, a way in which you try to solve the problem, drawing on a set of tools and approaches that you've tried and tested. And I think if we begin to do that, we begin to shift the mindset of teachers towards much more thinking about the learner and where they're coming from, and also being aware of the risk for some of them to drop out and not learn. Thank you very much. I think I managed to do that in about 40 minutes or so, 25 minutes. Thank you.
So that was an amazing tour de force, covering so many of the issues that many of us have been talking about for years, frankly, and doing it in 25 minutes. We'll open it up, and people can put questions in the chat box or comments. I'd like to start with a question to you, a broad question, just while people are thinking of their own questions. And that is, I'm assuming that you've presented versions of this to people who are in policy-making positions. I know you've been very active in this area at the time. Can you give us a sense of what the reaction is when you give a reconceptualization like this? Do people say, oh yes, we should have been doing this for the last 25 years? Or, we've already been doing this, you're just repackaging it? Can you give us a sense of the reaction so far?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. And yes, when I've presented this or had a discussion around this, I think that there's general agreement that this is something that we need to tackle. The problem is how. Often the question they ask is, how do we actually do this? But secondly, there is a very strong, there's a lot of pressure on trying to find quick solutions. There isn't that, and I think part of it is that in Africa is the legacy of our colonial educational system, that some see this as too radical. teaching is very much strongly, the idea of teaching is very much about, you do your training, you have a bit of exposure in the classroom, and this is what you do. So there's general agreement. I think we haven't done enough to say, okay, what does this actually look like in the way we design the curriculum and test it? So there is, I would say, there is sympathy for this, for some of what I've said. But also there is sometimes resistance because they think it's too complex. It's how do we actually do this in a way which ensures that we can deliver outcomes for everybody. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but general positiveness, but about the message. But I think the how is still a problem that policymakers are not, but also there are very powerful influences from the global world. In the work that I do on the Global Education Advisory Panel, we do know some of these things work, but how do you scale this up? How do you make this, you're talking about a system, how you change that? And a lot of factors influence it. But I think that for me, a good start is to say that the direction in which we're moving is not going to solve the problem. And that's the message I try to bring across from this kind of presentation I make.
Yeah, that is a terrific answer. You have several comments already showing up in the chat box. I'll get to those in a second. I want to do a quick follow-up with you based on what you just said. Do you find on the issue of resistance, because students like our students are always interested in trying to work on the hard problems. This is clearly a hard problem. Yeah. And institutional structures, I think, as you were just saying, are part of that resistance. And part of the word that often comes up is, how can we scale up? The national governments are always interested, as are the donor organizations, in saying, we need to do more for less. But isn't it the case that your approach suggests that if you're going to try to diversify and be more sensitive to student diversity, that's going to be actually not easy to scale up, because you're going to have to have different solutions, even micro solutions for different students or groups of students?
Well, I mean, I'm more optimistic. I think we can scale it up. I think we do need to, and I'll give a quick example. When we were doing some of this work in Kenya, one of the things we did was to video teachers who are teaching and to show them what we were seeing and to ask them to explain what was. And they were really surprised that once they were confronted with the evidence about what was going on, they were thought, okay, it looks like I lost half of the children in this classroom, okay? And then we followed them up. And the more they reflected on that, we could actually see them as, responding to some of these challenges. The problem, though, is that many teachers in Africa are constructed in deficit terms, and this is the worrying thing, that if you the teaching force is not sophisticated, this is too experimental, we don't, teachers will be doing different things. So there's a lack of trust in teachers. And therefore it's much more easier if you can prescribe something for them. But I strongly believe that teachers are quite, they're quite resourceful. They're trying to do the best under very difficult conditions. In many African classrooms, you find teachers teaching 160 or more children in the classroom. Now, you try to do that, no matter what qualification you have, you suddenly realize how difficult it is. So it's not that these teachers are stupid. I think we haven't trusted them to be able to solve the problem. And if we did that, I'm very convinced that we would get teachers who are really engaging at scale at this problem. But we've not even started that by looking at how we train them. And I think this is where the resistance is coming from, that the teachers we have are not strong enough. And we cannot just afford to just let them problem solve and try different things and experiment. But I'm very optimistic that if we did that, the teachers would really rise up to the challenge. And when in our research, we've engaged our teachers with these challenges, they've actually come out with really good ideas about how to do that. It's just that this has not been valued in their training. So they don't seem to see that as something that they can do and contribute to.
Oh, that's a terrific answer and great food for thought. I'm looking at the chat box now. One comment was, Could you say a little bit more about your criticism of learner-centered pedagogy? Does it differ? In what way does it differ, Kwame, from what you were just saying a moment ago of
Okay.
problem solving?
I think that the learner-centered pedagogy, I mean, and I've engaged with this since the 90s in Ghana and many other countries. Is it what it seems to work when you're implementing it? You go back 2-3 years later on, and teachers have reverted back to what they were doing. The thing is that the way in which it's presented is through what I consider as through a Western lens, a construction of learner-centered pedagogy, which does not take into account the African context and how Africans construct learning and engage with that. In some of the work we are doing in Ethiopia, we are finding that you can recontextualize learner-centered pedagogy in ways which are much more linked into the community and the background experiences of the children. And if you did that, you have a form of learner-centered pedagogy, which is not simply a question of either learner-centered or teacher-centered. Okay, I think this is the problem, that we're trying to replace teacher-centered with learner-centered. But we are beginning to see that you can have a reconfiguration or reconceptualization of learner-centered in ways which takes into account the background context, the ways in which children learn in the community and the society, and use that as vehicles for engaging with learning. And so I think that is possible, but not in the form in which we artificially group children to be able to discuss something, to present it. These are artificially engineered, and this does not reflect the ways in which many children learn and socialize. Many African children also, if you go back to their homes, the way they relate with their parents, they relate in their community. We need to take into account what is it about those relationships, engagement with play. How can we bring that into the classroom? And use that as a mechanism for reconstructing learner-centered pedagogy. And we are seeing that work brilliantly in some of the work we are doing in Ethiopia, where you're seeing classrooms that are really repurposing learner-centered pedagogy as it's been often framed from the Western context in ways which you would not recognize as learner-centered in the traditional form. But it's actually delivering very effective learning at the level at which children are at as far as their learning is concerned.
Okay, so we have a number of different chats. I've been trying to multitask. I didn't realize how hard this was because I'm so interested in hearing what you're saying. It's hard to read at the same time, but at least a couple of the questions I will now sort of pull them together. I think lead me to ask a question on behalf of a couple of the chats. What kind of resistance do you have from teachers themselves? Our teacher unions, our teacher associations, what do they say when they hear you speak? Do they say, well, what kind of reaction do you get?
That's a good question. I think I think what we have to remember is if you look at African education systems post-independence, it hasn't changed very much. And I have to be honest myself, my own understanding of what works and how to improve it has come from my research and my reflection. This is looking at the evidence day in and day out, engaging with it, and really rethinking, why is this not working over the years that I've been involved in that? So many of them are places where they don't seem to see that they have a problem. They will say, well, we need more resources, we need more training, and also we need to do, their understanding of teaching is about learning to teach in a college or in an institution. And they see if you move teaching much more into the school level, you are deprofessionalizing the profession. Those are the kind of resistance that we tend to face from the unions. But I think in principle, they are in broad agreement with the prognosis. I think they don't resist that. It's the how and a greater recognition about whether they think that, whether they are prepared to say that actually what we're doing is not working and we need to really change the way we do things. Unfortunately, they tend to blame the system, they tend to blame the resources. Sometimes they blame, some of them are legitimate concerns they have. Teachers need resources, they need support. These things are not there. So this is sometimes what I get from sharing this kind of thing, this kind of message with them, because they do recognize this is the need, but they defer to the system again and say this is where the problem is coming from.
So thank you. And relatedly, and this again bridges across, not directly, but I know that in our School of Education, there's a great interest in multilingualism, issues of language in education is a very big issue that teachers and students are interested in. How do you factor in, you alluded to that when you talked about diversity in the African classroom and classrooms even more generally. What is your reconceptualization? How would that play out around the issue of language? Is there a point of view that comes across?
Yes, I think, unfortunately, I didn't have time to talk a lot about it, but that is central to what the whole reconceptualization, because like I said, many of the children would really get disillusioned about learning, about it in their first engagement with formal schooling. And one of the reasons they do is because of the language of instruction. Okay, and I think that if you don't address that, you're going to have a problem. But it's not a simple problem to address. You know, when we, in one of our studies, we have 10, in Ghana, we have 10 official languages. These are official. But beyond official, you have another about 70 to 80. So we find that even in the community, in selecting the official language, sometimes there's resistance from the community. Why is my language not the preferred language? So you have to deal with that as a medium of instruction. Why am I learning this other language? You're suppressing my culture and my language, because language is linked to identity. And then you have the teachers themselves who do not come from those linguistic backgrounds. And we've tried to solve that in many ways. In Ghana, what we tried to do was to say that the communities have to sponsor a teacher from the community to do training so that they can come back and train in the community and teach in the community. But of course, once you train these teachers, they didn't want to live in these poor areas. They wanted to move out. So that did not work. Yeah. And I have said that we should use untrained teachers. Okay, we should use teachers in the communities in the early years, provide them with the support, because they have that linguistic ability. And it's so crucial to what they learn. If you can remove that barrier in the early years and support these teachers, you've prepared them adequately to make the transition into learning either French or English in the later grades. But there's also resistance from the unions. They don't like the idea of having untrained teachers teaching in the early grades. We've tried to address that in Ghana, but that's another topic. But that's also, you know, deprofessionalizing the teaching, because they say, well, you just can't have somebody in the community as a teacher. They have to go through formal training. And often this teacher is not fit for purpose because they don't have the language to be able to help the child in the early stages to engage with learning meaningfully. And that's why you have a lot of disillusioned children who then drop out in the early grades.
A couple of the chats are also now talking more about the curriculum. And you raised the issue of TARL, teaching at the right level, which also creates potential problems for teachers. They have to then figure out what level is it that they have to teach at. And it also creates problems for the government, because they used to think they knew what the curriculum ought to cover. But if you're teaching at all different levels and kids are coming out in all different ways, and parents probably too, are saying, I'd rather have my kid learn English even badly than learn a local language well. How does your reconceptualization deal with that? I mean, you've raised, the implications are quite large of what you're proposing. So even teaching at the right level, which is a popular topic these days, it'll come up at this conference we're involved in coming up soon. How does that intersect with your approach to teacher education?
Yes, I think it's a very, very important question, and it's a question that we should take very seriously. In some of the work we've been doing in Ethiopia, I think we are beginning to understand how you do this. You know, I think that the responsibility for learning in teacher education is often placed on the teacher much more than on the learner. In Ethiopia, in some of the work we are doing with alternative basic education or accelerated learning education, we are finding that the way in which teachers can use the curriculum to repurpose so that teaching is at the right level is that they have, the teacher has one textbook, you know, but the way in which they present it is such that the children have to then, they are put in groups that reflect their local customs and identity in play group and whatever it is. What the children do, which is amazing, and we have very strong evidence to show how they're succeeding in learning, is that they take what the teacher does, and then they have to reconstruct it, either through a play, through games, through different ways. And there's a high metacognitive process which takes place there. And then they have to share that, they have to engage with that. So when you go into these classrooms, you see what I've called organized chaos. You see children who are actually actively repurposing the curriculum. And these are children who dropped out. So we're not talking about children who are coming from backgrounds. They have the capacity. And then we track them. We find that when they get back into the mainstream system, they use that repurposing of learning and are able to succeed even in traditional classrooms. So I think we can do that by creating a way in which we deliver the curriculum in ways in which the learner engages at it at their level, can try to make sense of it, can try to represent that. And I think if we did that, we will be creating really strong opportunities to learn and for children to succeed. And the children who have done that, when we track them over 6-7 years, were outperforming children who had been taught through the traditional way. And these were school dropouts. So and we're able to achieve this in 10 months. So I'm very optimistic that this is possible. The children are very creative and imaginative. And yet you go into a classroom and all the child does is to sit and just watch what the teacher does. And that cannot create inclusive learning. The contract has to be between the teacher and the learner. And I think if the learner is doing about 70% of the talk, you're going to get a meaningful talk organized around the curriculum. You're going to get them to grow and to learn at their own level. So I think it's possible, and we are seeing that happen in some of our research.
So maybe you were being, I thought, somewhat critical of the traditional learner-centered approaches earlier in the talk. What you've just described sounds like another version of learner-centered pedagogy.
Yes, exactly.
Is there a nuance there that we're missing? Or are you repackaging it in a different way? Or is there something structurally that is different than what has transpired before?
Yes, I think if you look at traditional learner-centered pedagogy in many African classrooms, the responsibility for the learner-centeredness comes from the teacher. Mm-hmm. And they do this either by putting children into, giving them a task and creating what I call artificial interaction. It's not really genuine because the agenda for learning is not set by the learners, it's set by the teacher. But they are using mechanisms that are alien to they are not drawing on the funds of knowledge that the children bring. If you went into an accelerated learning classroom in Ethiopia, you look at the wall, 70% to 80% of every material that has been created by the child. The material for learning is child created. Okay, so I think that is what I mean by repurposing the learner-centered approach in a way which takes on a character which is very much in line with the culture and the background of the learners. We've seen it in Liberia. In Liberia, it's different. It's slightly different from Ethiopia, but it takes into account those cultural values and practices and repurposes it. And I think that's what I mean. That and it's not replacing teacher-centered with learner-centered. I think that's the mistake we do make. We've got to, all teacher-centered is bad, learner-centered is good. No, you have a mixture, you have a blend. And I think when you do that, you achieve much more. So my criticism of the learner-centered is really more the traditional ways in which it's been presented and often it's been written about. It's been very much critiqued that it doesn't simply work over time in the ways we present it in schools.
Well, that is, we did say we'd end about now because some people have to get into class in about 10 minutes. Let me just say that having heard you speak, I think this is a good point to have us draw a line, but I must say, Kwame, I can see from the nodding heads and the chat box that you have really been inspirational to all of us, and in an area which sometimes one feels, you sort of started off by saying you've been at this for 25 years and haven't seen too much change. And for many of us who are in academia, that is sort of the world that we're living in. But I think your willingness to challenge the assumptions and stay enthusiastic and actually make meaningful actions that are also research-based in Africa is, I think, impressive to all of us. We definitely want you to come back and join us. There is a global webinar where you will be doing that in a few weeks, but more on a global scale. But, you know, just fantastic. I think we all can give you another round of applause. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And
if I'll be happy to share some of the work that I've spoken about. I can send that, and then if any of your students are interested to follow up on some of those, I'm happy for them to contact me.
Well, that's fine. We'll make it available for sure. And ITA will make sure that that happens. And just to say that there were more chats than I could cover in trying to get back to you, but I tried to link various issues together. Anyway, you've answered some of the toughest questions that are out there. Not that we have them solved, as you say, we're still staying in a problem-solving mode. But thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you again soon and in person before long, I hope. So thank you so much, Kwame.
Thank you for having me, and all of you take care and stay safe.
Okay. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.